Well, as Africa's middle class continues to expand rapidly, there's more disposable income and increasing demand is contributing to a boom in Africa's property sector. So how well does Africa compare with global levels when it comes to property investment, and how prominently does Africa feature as a retail investment destination? Joining us now for more insight on that is Francois Viruli, who is a property economist and professor at the University of Cape Town. Good morning, Francois. Perhaps the first thing to do is, certainly in South Africa, we have a very advanced property sector. We have a lot of data on it. It's well understood. There's a lot of investment sophistication, if you like. Set the scene for us as to where the African continent broadly, and perhaps with a couple of examples of particular countries, where does it sit, the property sector, in terms of investment and growth?
David, I think it's a very interesting point. Obviously, we first of all have economies that are growing very rapidly at the moment. And if we take some examples, if we take Nigeria, if we take Ghana as examples, these are economies that are growing at the rates not that far off what we're seeing in China at the moment. So invariably, that leads to a demand. I think where it becomes interesting, as you rightly pointed out, these are markets that are rapidly maturing. If we take Lagos, for example, until very recently, it probably had one community shopping center. And that is changing. The middle class is growing, and we are seeing in particular a lot of interest in the retail sector. And I think what will be interesting in the years to come is whether that will also move into the office sector. South African investors are there, and we can talk about that, yes.
Well, let's talk about those South African investors. You've got some big pension funds in South Africa. You've got other investors. They're used to moving in this kind of environment, and they might see big opportunities in the rest of Africa.
Absolutely. And I think what is interesting is, first of all, this is an environment where I suppose you can argue that you need a bit of patient money. You need to take your time about it. Financing is sometimes difficult. Many of the shopping centers that are being built at the moment, their size is not determined so much even by the size of the market, but by the funding available. So yes, so we are seeing the Liberty Lives of this world, we're seeing the Sanlams, we're seeing quite a number of South African players entering that market. And I think that what we will really start seeing in the next few years are some very interesting property funds listed in South Africa and maybe even elsewhere that will be focused on some of the best properties across the African continent. But it will take time. And I think, I've been involved probably some 15 years in the African property markets. And I remember 15 years ago, we were talking about land tenure issues and so forth. And now in the last few years, we are talking about listing of funds. We're looking at the investment opportunities. And I think what will be interesting to see is how these markets actually evolve. It's one thing to build something, but it's something quite different to manage those sort of properties across the continent.
Well, also, I've heard you talk about the Dubai effect. What is the Dubai effect, and why is it such a risk?
At the extreme, the Dubai effect is about fully sold out, but there's no one there. And what of course happened in Dubai, a lot of people invested in those markets, but there were actually very few tenants, especially in the residential market. No, I think that where the big risk, of course, lies is that those markets are starting up, and there is always a risk of oversupply. The first developer does well, the next developer does somewhat less well, and the third sees the problems of the market. So I think we have to be fairly careful as we start entering those markets. And I must add that if you take your flights to Accra at the moment or Lagos, there will always be some developers on there, builders and property people. Of course, a lot of the investors, the players here are seeing those opportunities at the moment. But yes, we are not the only player in this market. We started as being the big players, but I can assure you that at the moment, British investors, American investors to some degree, are also looking at this market.
Also looking at some of those African cities, for South African investors in particular, there are still opportunities in South Africa, aren't there? So it's not as if this is a saturated market for property development and investment.
And I think that's going to be the main question that we will have to pose. Of course, we've come from a property boom. We've been going through relatively difficult years, certainly from the construction sector. We're starting to see improvements there. So yes, there are investors who are saying, why fly 6 hours across the African continent when there are still opportunities, and some of those opportunities, whether they're in the Eastern Cape and elsewhere. We have our own middle class that is growing with its retailing opportunities. Even the townships are still offering opportunities. So yes, I think that that balance needs to be found, and certain investors that I certainly speak to still argue that there are enough opportunities in South Africa to look at before starting to crisscross the African continent. I think the other thing also to bear in mind, and that is that doing a development in whether in Nigeria, Ghana, or elsewhere, it's difficult. There are very difficult land issues to get through at some point. Only recently I was in Addis Ababa. And what did I see in front of me? A lot of half-finished buildings. Well, your initial view would be, well, the market is oversupplied. If you start looking a bit further, you start realizing that the Ethiopian government had taken a view that if you were given a piece of land, you had to develop within 3 years. So what you do, you start developing and not finishing it at that point. But at least you've started and no one will take the land from you. So you really have to enter those markets with a very clear understanding of the local context and what works. And that can be very different to what we see in South Africa.